Right. So we are redoing the study because last time we had terrible weather, right? So today we are going to talk about Matthew, Luke, and the times of the Gentiles. This is a phrase that is found in Luke, right? So in our previous studies, we noticed that Matthew 24 has a dual fulfillment. The first fulfillment was in the events that led up to the destruction of Jerusalem in the year AD 70. The second application of Matthew 24, the second fulfillment, is when the events at the end of the world lead up to the second coming of Jesus Christ, right? So the second are the events in the end time that immediately precede the destruction of the world. However, a question surfaces, right? And now as we begin, it says, does Matthew 24 address the period between the destruction of Jerusalem and the events that lead up to the second coming of Jesus? Or does Matthew 24 bypass this long period of Christian history between the destruction of Jerusalem and the end time events, right? As we have seen in previous studies, there is only one great tribulation, right? One great tribulation divided into two parts, with a pause in between these two parts, and we are right now in the pause of that of these two parts, right? So the first part is from 538 to 1798 AD. That's the period of papal dominion. The second period is after the pause period ends, when the deadly wound that the papacy received is healed, right? And then the papacy begins to behave in the end time events as it did in the past, because the papacy hasn't changed, right? Right now it has a deadly wound, so its activities are curtailed. So the question is, once again, does Matthew 24 address both of these periods? Because it addresses up to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, but does it address the period in between? Now, in a certain sense, we noticed already that Matthew 24 does. However, Matthew 24, it appears that to bypass, generally speaking, this period of church history between the destruction of Jerusalem and the end time events, right? It seems to focus primarily on the events that will take place after the pause, right? After the pause ends, but not, not that period in between. However, in today's study, we are going to notice that, and we are going to examine a parallel passage to Matthew 24. Now, remember when we began, we said we have to study the parallel passages of Matthew 24, which is Luke 21 and Mark 13, because each synoptic gospel gives us added information, right? So today we are going to study the parallel passage found in Luke 21 verses 20 and 21, right? This period of church history, where in Luke 21, 20 and 21, this period of church history is clearly addressed. It becomes clear when we compare Luke 21, 20 and 21 with Daniel 7, 25 and Revelation chapter 12 verses 6 to 12 and Revelation chapter 13 verses 5 and Revelation chapter 11 verses 2, 3, 6, right? We are going to see, it becomes those passages I told you are parallel. They talk about the same thing, right? We're going to discuss them in detail. We'll unpack them in detail. So we're going to take a look at all of these passages to see how they relate to one another. And we're going to see that Luke does have a strong focus on the period of the 1,260 years when the papacy primarily predominated in Europe, right? So that's what we are going to talk about. So now let's get into our study. Let's compare Matthew 24 with Luke 21, right? As Matthew 24, Matthew 24, as we examine this chapter after the sign of the abomination of desolation, we find 5 sequential signs. Now remember, Matthew 24 is chronologically listed the events, right? So it's very clear, Matthew 24. Now, if you go to Daniel, Daniel goes in cycles. Daniel will go forward and Daniel will go backward. Revelation, when we studied the entire book of Revelation, we found that it went in cycles. It went forward, it went backward, it amplified in between. But Matthew 24 goes sequentially in chronological order. So it's easy to understand it better, right? So now when you read Matthew 24, we find 5 sequential signs. One is the destruction of earthly Jerusalem, verses 15 to 20. A period of severe tribulation, verses 21 to 28. Then signs in the sun, moon, and stars, which is found in verse 29. The shaking of the powers of heaven, and the sign and the appearance of the Son of Man in verses 30 to 31, right? However, the parallel verses in Luke 21 appear to have only 4 sequential signs, right? Let's notice these 4 sequential signs that are referred to in Matthew 24. This is the parallel to Matthew. Luke 21 is a parallel to Matthew 20. So Luke talks about the destruction of earthly Jerusalem in verses 20 to 24. Signs in the sun and the moon and the stars, verse 25. Shaking of the powers of heaven, and then the sign of the coming of the Son of Man, verses 25 to 26. So missing here is the sign that we find in number 2 of Matthew 24. It appears that the sign of the great tribulation, the severe tribulation, is missing in Luke 21. However, we must ask, is the tribulation sign really missing in Luke 21? As we shall see, the answer is no. Luke simply describes the tribulation sign differently to what Matthew calls it a severe tribulation. Luke uses a different way of describing, right? So we're going to find out that Luke describes this tribulation period. He calls it as the trampling of the holy city by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are full. So Luke gives us a different definition for this severe time of tribulation. So Luke simply describes the tribulation sign differently as the period which the Gentiles would trample upon Jerusalem. Okay, that's what he calls it. Now we need to notice, first of all, that one thing is very, very clear in the first half of Luke 21 and Luke 24, and that is that the first half of this verse is describing the siege of Jerusalem by the Roman legions that led to the destruction of the literal city of Jerusalem, the literal temple, and the exile of the literal citizens of Jerusalem to all nations. That is the first half of Luke 21, verse 24. But Luke 21, verse 24, part B, is what we are going to discuss today in greater detail, which talks about this period of severe tribulation that Matthew calls it. Luke calls it the period which the Gentiles would trample upon Jerusalem, right? So we are discussing that. Now, Luke 24, like I said, the first part deals with the literal destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 by the Roman legions, right? So the second half of this verse is transitional. It describes the trampling of spiritual and symbolic Jerusalem by spiritual and symbolic Gentiles for a symbolic period. So from literal, Luke transitions to spiritual, right? First half is literal, second half is spiritual, right? So in the second part, we are dealing with a different Jerusalem, a spiritual Jerusalem, a spiritual Gentile, and a symbolic time period. So let's read Luke 21, verse 24. First, remember, first half of it is talking about literal Israel in AD 17. The second half is talking about the spiritual Israel. So let's read Luke 21, 20.
And they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled, until the period of the Gentiles comes to an end.
That's a different translation. So notice that the first half of the verse, they will fall. Now this is literal Jerusalem by the edge of the sword and be led captive into nations, right? All nations. So that was done by the Romans. Now we find in the second half of this verse, when we are looking at the verse, Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Okay, the New Living Translation translates the second part a bit more clearly. It says, until the period of the Gentiles comes to an end. Okay, now here are the basic elements of Luke chapter 21, 24. Right? So we have Jerusalem. Jerusalem will be trampled. By whom? By the Gentiles. Until this denotes the ending point. Right? From some point until some time. And the until is the time of the Gentiles comes to an end. So there is an ending point. So there is until denotes that there is a clearly a time period, right? So the Gentiles have a beginning point and they have an ending point. Now, although Luke does not mention the beginning or the ending point, we have to go elsewhere in scripture to find the beginning and ending points, right? Because the Bible tells us that when we study here a little bit, there a little bit, we go all over to the Bible to get answers for that. And the Bible clearly gives answers to all these questions, but we need to, it's like digging for gold. It's like digging for treasure. We have to look for them, right? So in other words, Luke 21, 24, there are two cities of Jerusalem, one literal, one symbolic, two tramplings of the city, one literal, one symbolic, two groups of Gentiles, one literal and one symbolic. Okay. Now, Louis Were was an Australian evangelist, and his primary work was done in the 40s and 50s. Had a very interesting quotation in his book, The King of the North at Jerusalem. Now, this is a very important principle of prophetic interpretation. Let's read what he has to say there.
When passing over into the Christian era, there is an automatic transition from literal to spiritual Babylon, from literal to spiritual Jerusalem, from literal lands of Israel and Babylon to their spiritual antitypes.
Okay, so that's clear, right? So up to the time of the stoning of Stephen, we are dealing with literal Jerusalem, right? And dealing with literal Gentile. Then later on, after AD 34, after the establishment of the Christian church, we have spiritual antitype, right? Babylon is no longer literal. Jerusalem is no longer literal. Jerusalem refers to the Christian church, and the Gentiles are referred to, and the Gentiles refer to the papacy that persecutes God's people. So we'll see this in greater detail as we unpack in our study, right? Now, Jerusalem is the people. Now remember, we are discussing the second part of Luke 21, 24. It describes the trampling of Jerusalem by Gentiles. Now, this is not referring to the literal city, a literal city of brick and mortar. Jesus uses the word Jerusalem many times in the Bible to refer to the people of the city. In other words, the trampling of the city in the second part of Luke 21, 24 is dealing not with trampling a literal city of brick and mortar. It is talking about the people of the city that are trampled upon, right? Now, let's go first of all to a text in the Old Testament. This speaks about the first destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. And we're going to notice that Nebuchadnezzar took all Jerusalem captive, right? Notice the following text that uses the word Jerusalem to refer to the people who were living in the city of Jerusalem at that time. Let's read 2 Kings 24, verses 14 and 15.
Also, he carried into captivity all Jerusalem, all the captains and all the mighty men of valor, 10,000 captives, and all the craftsmen and smiths. None remained except the poorest people of the land.
Okay. So did Nebuchadnezzar take the walls of Jerusalem, the temple of Jerusalem, and the city itself into captivity? No, not brick and mortar. It's talking about people that make up the city. So carrying Jerusalem into captivity means people are carried into captivity, right? That's clear. Jesus also considered Jerusalem, the word Jerusalem, to refer to the inhabitants of the city. Remember when he descended the Mount of Olives, he personified the city of Jerusalem. Here Jesus is coming down the eastern slopes towards the Golden Gate of Jerusalem on the eastern side. And we find him speaking these words found in Luke 19, verses 41 to 40.
Now, as he drew near, he saw the city and wept over it, saying, if you had known, even you, especially in this your day, the things that make for you your peace. However, now they are hidden from your eyes. For days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment around you, surround you and close you in on every side, and level you and your children within you to the ground, and they will not leave in you one stone upon another, because you did not know the time of your visitation.
Okay, so here Jesus is actually talking about the people of Jerusalem. Let's go to another scriptural verse. So obviously, the physical city of Jerusalem would not know the time of God's visitation because it's a city, right? It's inanimate. It has no conscience. However, when Jesus says, you did not know the hour of your visitation, he's talking about the people of Jerusalem. He's talking to the people of Jerusalem. Now, Matthew 23, 37 to 39, once again, we find Jesus referring to Jerusalem as the people. Clearly, the brick and mortar in the following verses did not kill the prophets. So let's read Matthew 23, 37 to 39.
O Jerusalem,
Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I say to you, you shall see me no more till you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.
So clearly, from these texts that we read, when Jesus refers to Jerusalem, he's talking about the people, right? So the last part of the verse, we find Luke 21, 24. He's not talking about the trampling of a literal city of Jerusalem by the literal Romans. He's talking about the spiritual Jerusalem, the people that have been trampled by a power that is referred to as the Gentile, right? So that's talking about a power that is referred to as the Gentile. Now, 4 key elements in Luke 21, 24b and Revelation 11, 2. Remember, we are going to compare with Revelation 11, Revelation 12, Revelation 13, and Daniel. So this is one that we are comparing with Revelation chapter 11, verse 2, right? Let's notice this is a very interesting verse, which is parallel to Luke 21, 24. And if you remember, there are 4 elements in the second half of Luke 24. What were they? Jerusalem, trampling, Gentiles, time of the Gentile. The word until specifies a definite ending point, until something happens. So there is an ending point. Notice the relationship between Luke 21, 24 and Revelation 11, verses 2, and then we will read verse 3 and what it says there. Let's read verse 2 first.
However, leave out the court which is outside the temple and do not measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months.
Okay, so there we find the holy city. Remember the other one we found Jerusalem. Now it's being referred to as holy city. Trampling underfoot, we find trampling there. Then it says Gentiles. The Gentiles were found in Luke 21. And it says, now it gives a time period. It says for 42 months. Interesting, isn't it? Luke says until the time of the Gentiles, right? Ending point. So Revelation 11:2 gives us a time period. Now remember that we found the same elements, but it's like the Holy Spirit, like I said, we found the parallel, but Revelation gives us a time period. So the 42 months are the time of the Gentiles that Luke 21:24 is talking about. So we can clearly notice this parallel between these two verses, especially the last half of Luke 21:24 and Revelation 11:2, because we find they are the same four parts or elements that are found in both texts. But now notice verse 3, which follows immediately after 2, verse 2, where it speaks about the trampling of Jerusalem. In Revelation 11:2, and then we have another period that is mentioned in verse 3, which is the same period, but it's expressed differently. Now, Revelation 2 calls it 42 months, but Revelation 3 gives us a different, expresses it different. So let's read Revelation 11:3.
And I will give power to my two witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth.
So the two witnesses are the Bible, the Old and the New Testament. So during this period, people couldn't read the Bible, right? So that's why it says they shall prophesy in sackcloth. So verse 3 describes 42 months of verse 2 as 1,260 days, right? So these two are parallel, right? They are referring to the same period. Now we need to understand a very important biblical principle in Bible prophecy, and that is that the time periods in prophecy are symbolic. In other words, you apply the year-day principle to biblical time prophecy. So one literal day is equal to one literal year. And in the Jewish calendar, a year comprised of 360 days, 30 days for a month. So which means that 42 months are not literal 42 months. They're actually 42 months times 30 for the days, right? 42 months into 30 days for each month, right? Which gives us the 1,260 days. So in other words, we are dealing with 1,200, and the day in prophecy is equal to a literal year, right? So we are actually dealing with 1,260 year period. Now that is the time of the Gentiles, right? This is what Revelation 11:2 and 3 are referring to. So it says there in verse, I will give power to my two witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days, which is years, clothed in sackcloth. Now, this literal city is already destroyed. Okay? Now we're going to analyze. This is an important point we need to understand. John wrote Revelation 11:2 at the end of the 1st century. So in other words, he wrote this around the year 95 AD, right? 25 years earlier, the Roman legions had already destroyed the literal city of Jerusalem. So in other words, literal Jerusalem had been in ruin for 25 years, and the inhabitants of the city were already in captivity. They had dispersed into many nations. So the literal city and the literal temple had already been destroyed when John wrote Revelation 11 verses 2 and 3. Therefore, Revelation 11:2 cannot refer to the destruction of the literal city of Jerusalem, because that literal city was destroyed, right? And that took place in AD 7. So clearly, John in Revelation 11:2 and 3, speaking about a future desolation of the trampling of Jerusalem. Okay. Then we have the Gentiles and Jerusalem, right? Now the question is, who are the Gentiles and what is Jerusalem or the holy city in Revelation 11:2? Now in one of our previous studies, remember we saw Jerusalem during the Christian dispensation referred to, Jerusalem referred to God's faithful church, and the Gentiles refer to the enemies of God's faithful church, right? Several texts makes this clear, like Revelation 3:9, Matthew 18:15-18, they tell us that it is possible for a believer to be considered the Gentile rather than a spiritual citizen of spiritual Jerusalem. So in other words, we are not dealing with literal Jews, nor are we dealing with literal Gentiles. The literal Israel or Jerusalem represents the church. So wherever you see Jerusalem referred to, it's talking about the church, right? Represents the church. And wherever literal Gentiles represent enemies of Christ's church. Now we look at several Bible verses where this is proven, where this what we are talking about is proven, right? So let's go through some of them. So in other, the text, let me give you the text just to prove that. Romans 9:6-8, Romans 2:28-21, Galatians 3:26-39, where you find that if you are Christ, you are Abraham's seed. Then John 1:47-49, and John 4:23-24, and John 8:31-58. These clearly are talking about the Jerusalem is God's church, and the Gentiles are the enemies of Christ's church. So in other words, we are Israel if we are Christ, right? And Jerusalem are the faithful people of God, the faithful church of God, while the Gentiles are those who are enemies of God's people, right? So that answers that question. Who are the Gentiles and what is Jerusalem, right? And the focus is on the heavenly sanctuary in this verse. Now here's another important one. Revelation 11:1, in Revelation 11:1, the angel told John to measure the temple and those who worship in it. When it talks about measuring, it's referring to judgment, right? You measure, you're judging, right? But the angel told John not to measure the court because it was given to the Gentiles for 42 months. So John, there was no judging of the court for 42 months because it was given to the Gentiles, right? Until the time of the Gentiles were fulfilled, right? And that was the sanctuary and the courts. So in other words, the court of the temple was given to the enemies of God for 42 months, after which the angel told John to measure the temple. After the 42 months, the 1,260 years that have been given to the Gentiles to trample God's people, after that, measure the temple. So judgment takes place after this period of 1,260 years, right? Now, this is very interesting because immediately after the times of the Gentiles, we find this measuring of the temple. So it can't be the literal Jewish temple because, like we have established, it has been destroyed. So it must refer to the heavenly sanctuary, right? It must refer to the heavenly temple because God said the temple here on earth was a copy of what was in heaven. So then if the earthly one is destroyed, then it has to refer to the heavenly temple. Now when John once again wrote the book of Revelation, the earthly temple was destroyed. So this means that the temple referred to here must be the one in heaven. And the worshippers must be those who worship there spiritually, right? We are to understand that the temple is the heavenly sanctuary, literally, and the church is spiritual. So the temple in heaven is literal, the church is spiritual and global. So it must be the temple of the Christian dispensation. church. The temple is the church of the Christian temple, and the temple in heaven, right? The worshippers in that temple must not be people who are literally worshiping in heaven, but they worship by faith. They're entering the heavenly temple by faith, where Jesus is interceding for his people, right? So in other words, we have to understand the temple is the heavenly sanctuary, and the church spiritually is the earthly reflection of that temple. We're clear on this point, right? That is that we have the time of the Gentiles, and then we have the measuring of the temple. So you have this 1,260 years when the enemies of God will trample God's spiritual church here, God's faithful people on earth, and immediately following that will be the judgment, right? Because the angel was told John to measure the temple. That's clear, right? Now, let's notice something else that's very, very interesting. Notice, according to Revelation 11:2, the trampling of the city occurred for a period of 42 months. We already noticed that this period is described as 1,260 days or years. Now, this links the 42 months of verse 2 with the 1,260 days, years of verse 3, right? It's the same period. We are clear about that. But now notice something even further. It links Revelation 11:2-3, links with the 1,260 days of Revelation 12:6. The 42 months of Revelation 13:5, right? So in other words, Revelation 12 and 13 amplify Revelation 11:2-3, right? So it's amplifying these 1,260 days or 42 months are amplified in Revelation 12:6 and Revelation 13:50. 42, 260 days, 260 days, and 42 months. It's referring to the same period. Clear? Now, in order to fully understand Revelation, right? That is, we're still talking about Revelation 11:2-3. We must not only go to Revelation 12 and 13 that amplifies this, but we also have to go to the Old Testament, to the roots of this prophecy, and find those roots. And we find those roots in the little horn prophecy of Daniel 7:21 and 25, verses 25, Daniel 8, verses 11-13. Now, in these verses, we are going to find a power, right? A little horn power that tramples underfoot the temple of God. Now, we know the temple of God is God's, in the Christian dispensation, God's church, and it's true worship. This trampling of the temple and the worshippers of Daniel 7 and 8 does not refer to the destruction of literal Jerusalem and the captivity of literal Jews, right, in AD 70 by the Roman Empire. But rather it is referring to a rebellious little horn that introduced an idolatrous Christian worship that caused desolation after the breakup of the Roman Empire in 476 AD. Is that clear? Now let's go and unpack. Now, according to Daniel 7:21, verse 21 and verse 25, where we find this little horn blasphemed God and persecuted his people. He thought he could change the time and the laws of God. And here we get a different timing system, a different way this period is referred to. It's called time, times, and dividing of time. Now remember, time is a prophetic year of 360 days. So there is 1 year, times means 2 years, and a dividing of time, right? So there is 1, 2, 3 years and a half years, 3.5 years of prophetic time. So let's read Daniel 7:25.
He, the little horn, shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and law. Then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time and times and a half time.
Okay, right? So we see this little horn. Now we are getting a description of who this Gentile is. What is he going to do? Okay. So in order to understand Daniel 7:25, we must look at Daniel. We must look at Daniel 27 within its immediate context, right? So let us consider the chronological sequence of events that led to the rise of this little horn. So we have to look at the context of when did this happen? How did it happen? What sequence did it take? Right now we have done this before, but let's go. So we find the sequence was lion. The lion that is referred to there is Babylon. The bear is Medes and the Persians. The leopard is Greece. The dragon is Rome. Then it gets 10 horns, which is the division of the Roman Empire in the year 476. Then we find a little horn coming up. That's the papacy. That's the time period of the papacy is times, and dividing up times. And after that, the time period ends, which we know is 1798. The judgment begins in the heavenly temple, right? Now, just a little bit of information on that. The barbarians invaded the Roman Empire in 1760, during the 476 AD. They divided the empire into 10 kingdoms, and after the empire is divided, the division of the empire was completed in 476 AD. Remember, the times are very important, right? And then we had this little horn rising after 476 and the judgment. Immediately after the nefarious work of the little horn, the Bible tells us clearly that judgment in the heavenly temple begins. Okay? So in order for events, this order of events is very similar to Revelation 11, 1-3, where the measuring of the heavenly temple begins only after the Gentiles have finished trampling the city for 42 months. Okay? Now we have the times of the Gentiles, and you have the measuring of the temple. So the times of the Gentiles is the little horn, a period of dominion which persecutes the Christian church, and as soon as that period ends, the judgment begins. Now there's a very important detail in Daniel 7:25. And that is that the little horn intended to change God's law. Intended, he can't change God's law, right? We know that the Gospel of Matthew calls this the abomination of desolation, changing of God's law. Interestingly enough, now what was the greatest abomination that was being committed among God's people before the first destruction of Jerusalem? Okay? Now, according to Ezekiel 8, verses 14-16, the abomination that topped the list was the turning back on the Lord and worshiping the sun. The leaders were worshiping the sun. They were, Ezekiel 8 tells us that 25 elders had turned their back to the altar of God, turned their face towards the rising sun, and they were worshipping the sun. Now, this is the abomination of desolation during the first stage of the Great Tribulation. The papacy claimed to have the power to change worship on Sabbath, which is Saturday, the 7th day of the week, to Sunday. The enforcement of Sunday by civil law will be the abomination of desolation after the pause period during the second stage of the Great Tribulation. So in other words, the little horn during the 1260 years, during the times and dividing up times of 42 months, whichever way you want to express it, right? In some way thought that it would change God's holy law. And as we look at history, we know that this was fulfilled. The papacy unabashedly and quite clearly claims to have changed the Sabbath to Sunday as the day of worship, which is the day of the sun, right? They say they have the authority to change it, and they are not ashamed to say so, right? Now, Daniel 8, you can go to that, Daniel 8. Daniel 8 further amplifies this nefarious work of this little horn power by specifically saying that it trampled on the sanctuary and the host, right? The language is very similar to Revelation 11, 2 and 3, and Luke 21, 24 last, right? Daniel 8 describes two distinctive stages. Now remember, we are in the Old Testament in the root prophecy, right? Two distinctive stages of the little horn. One stage is horizontal and the other one is vertical, right? Both are Roman. The first stage is pagan Rome, right? It conquers horizontally, conquers people, the earth, right? And then this little horn that comes out from Rome mocks and attacks heaven vertically, right? So in other words, that becomes a religious horn because it's vertically attacking the holy temple in Jerusalem. It's attacking God. So then it becomes a religious thing, not horizontally was political conquering during the pagan Roman Empire. And then this little horn mocks and it starts attacking the heavenly sanctuary, which becomes a religious thing, right? It becomes a religious little horn. Now the first one is a political horn. Like I said, it was conquering geographically. The second is the same little horn. It has morphed into a little horn. And now it meddles with God, with the Lord in heaven. It tries to take away the ministry of the Prince of Hosts. The Prince of Hosts is Jesus. And the ministry that Jesus is doing in the holy, this time in the holy place of the sanctuary, right? It persecutes the saints of the Most High and tramples on the sanctuary. So Daniel 8, 9 is the horizontal. It's the first stage, the geographical conquering. Let's read Daniel 8, 9.
And out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land.
Okay, so now this is the little horn, right? Now he is conquering horizontally, geographically, right? That's the first stage. Then Daniel 8, 10 to 13, this is the vertical, second stage, vertical, where he's going to go to heaven. He's going to attack heaven, right?
And it grew up to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground, and trampled them. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices, and he cast truth down to the ground. He did all this and prospered. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that certain one who was speaking, "How long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot?"
Okay, so here we have the trampling that we find in Revelation 11, 2 and 3. And we have studied this before, but let's refresh our minds. The word sacrifice here is not there in the original manuscript. It was added there by the translators. So it doesn't belong there in verse 11. It is because it's not in the original. So what he did was the Prince of Hosts, by him the daily. He was taking away the daily. So what daily is what Jesus does for us daily in the holy place that he was trying to take away. We have studied that before, but this is a little refresher. So we say the little horn is doing the same thing that is referred to in Luke 21:24, part B, right? And also Revelation 11:3. So we have to connect Revelation 11, Luke 21:24, as well as Daniel 7 and 8, which gives us the times and dividing our times, and it gives us a greater understanding of what this little horn is and the work it does. Now, it is not coincidence that after the little horn trampled on the sanctuary and the host, the cleansing of the sanctuary, which is the judgment, begins in Daniel 8:14. That's Revelation 11:2, Daniel 7 and Daniel 8. In those chapters and verses, we find a trampling of the sanctuary and the host, followed by the measuring, judgment, cleansing of the same, the heavenly temple. Interestingly, each of these scenes in Revelation 11:2-3, after the times of the Gentiles, you have the measuring of the heavenly temple. Daniel chapter 7, after the little horn performs its work for times, and the dividing of times, you have the judgment scene. Then in Daniel 8, after the little horn tramples on the sanctuary and tramples on the host, you have the cleansing of the sanctuary or the judgment, right? So all those chapters and verses are connected. They're talking about the same event. Now we must link Daniel 7 and 8 with Revelation 11 and Revelation 13. So let's do that now. Revelation chapter 13. Now we're going to Revelation 13. We will deal with this first. Revelation chapter 13, you have the same sequence of powers that we noticed in Daniel. Okay? And the Revelation 13:5 also mentions the period of 42 months. Right? They are the beast to receive his seat, power and authority from the dragon. This is Revelation 31 and 2. Persecuted the saints and blasphemed the heavenly tabernacle and those who dwelled in. Right? So that is 6 and 7. Now remember, the dragon represents Satan working through the Roman Empire, because how do we know this? Because the dragon tried to slay the man-child that was Jesus when he was born through Herod, right? Satan did this through Herod, a ruler of the Roman Empire. So the sequence of powers in Revelation 13 is identical to that of Daniel 7:3. You get the lion, you get the bear, you get the leopard, you get the dragon, you get the 10 horn. That beast, according to Revelation 12, has 10 horns, which represent the 10 divisions of the Roman Empire. And the beast, the 42 months, the beast that comes from the sea. Okay? Now let's read Revelation 13:5-7, so we can see the connection between the little horn of Daniel 8 and Daniel 7 and Daniel chapter 11. All of those chapters are connected. So let's see what Revelation 13:5-7 say, because those are all connected chapters.
And he was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and he was given authority to continue for 42 months. Then he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name, his tabernacle, and those who dwell in heaven. It was granted to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them, and authority was given him over every tribe, tongue, and nation.
So can you see the connection here? The sequence, right? The sequence is same, and the connection between Daniel 7:8, Revelation 11, and Revelation 13, right? Now let's go to Daniel 7 and Revelation 12. Now we must see also whether the connection that connects Daniel 7 to Revelation chapter 12. Remember, we said we are talking about Revelation 11, 12, 13, Luke 21:24, and Daniel 7 and 8, right? Those are all connected chapters. So now let's make this connection, right? That we have been discussing. As we have seen, Revelation 11:13, there's a relationship with Revelation 12:6, because both refer to the 1,260 days. Even further, the terminology of Revelation 12:6 shares common language with Revelation 12:14. And Revelation 12:14 in turn has a connection with Daniel 7:25. So by this common reference to the times, and dividing of time. So if you have Bibles, you can cross-reference the texts so that you will be able to refer to them when you're studying. Sounds a bit confusing right now, but as we go through these different passages, we'll be able to put them all together and make perfect sense. So first, let's read Revelation chapter 11, verse 3.
And I will give power to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth.
Okay, so there is a reference to 1,260 days. Now let's read Revelation 12:6.
Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days.
Talking about the same period, right? Connect. Let's read Revelation 12:13 and 14.
Now when the dragon saw that he had been cast to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place, where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time from the presence of the serpent.
Okay, now let's connect this with Daniel 7:25.
He shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and law. Then the saints shall be given into the hand for a time and times and a half a time.
Okay, so can we safely reach the conclusion that the 3.5 times, the 1,260 days, and the 42 months, and the time of the Gentiles are all parallel expressions? A careful study of these time prophecies indicates clearly that their fulfillment took place during the 1,200-year period after the disintegration of the Roman Empire. This means that Jerusalem spoken about is not literal Jerusalem, but rather spiritual Jerusalem, because literal Jerusalem had already been devastated in the year 70 AD. So Luke 21:24, last part, is talking about the spiritual Jerusalem, God's faithful people in his Christian church. Right, moving on. Now, Albert Barnes, we have read from Albert Barnes. He's a Bible commentator. He's not an SDA. He's a Presbyterian Bible commentator. From long time ago, wrote a very interesting comment on the 42 months that we find in Revelation 11 and also in Luke 21:42, part B. Let's read what he had to say there.
The 42 months would embrace the whole period of the ascendancy and prevalence of the papacy, or the whole time of the continuance of that corrupt dominion in which Christendom was to be trodden down and corrupted by it. Thus, regarded, this would properly express the time of the ascendancy of the papal power, and the end of the 42 months or 1,260 years would denote the time when the influence of the power would cease.
Okay, so clearly he got it on spot on, right? He was right on target. Remember, he's a Presbyterian Bible commentator from many, many years ago. So he interprets Jerusalem as Christendom. Then the Gentiles would be the papacy, the persecutors of God's church. So in other words, the time of the Gentiles. I hope we can now clearly understand the time of the Gentiles comes to an end when the papacy received its deadly wound at the end of the 1,260 years in the year 1798, right? The period of papal dominion was 538 to 1798 AD, which was exactly 1,260 years. This is the time of the Gentiles, right? That Luke is talking about. This is times, and dividing of time. So let's summarize this time period so that we, as they were found in scripture, and the time of the Gentiles as we saw in Luke 21, 24, the last part. I've done a little bit of a summary there. 1,260 years. So we find 42 months of Revelation 2, then 3,242, right? So I hope that is clear that these 42 months, the 1,260 years, and the 3.5 times are referring to the same time period, right? Now, this is extremely significant. So basically what it means is Jerusalem in Luke 21, 24b, right? The second half is referring not to the literal Jerusalem, but rather to Jerusalem that represents the Christian church, and the Gentiles represent the Roman Catholic papacy. So in the times of the Gentiles, the phrase in the times of the Gentiles in Luke 21, 24 is referring to the period from 538 to 1798 AD, the period of papal dominion, right? So is that clear? In Luke 21, 24b, Jerusalem represents the Christian church, the Gentiles represent the Roman Catholic papacy that persecuted God's faithful people. In the times of the Gentiles, is the time period, the 1,260 time period is 538 AD to 1798 AD. And that was the time period of papal dominion. Okay? Clear? Okay. Now we have reached the conclusion that the two halves of Luke 21, 24 describe two distinctive tramplings of two different Jerusalem. Okay? So Luke says they will fall, the first part says they will fall by the edge of the sword and will be led away captives to all nations. The first half, it's describing literal Jerusalem, trampled by literal Rome in the year 1780. The second half, and Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are filled. That's the second half of the verse. It describes the trampling of the spiritual Jerusalem, which is God's church, by spiritual Rome, which is the papacy, from 538 to 1798 AD. Thus, Revelation 11, 2 and 3 expands on the second half of Revelation 21, 24. Is that clear? Okay, taking it is clear. Now let's take a few moments to focus on the sign of the destruction of literal Jerusalem in AD 9, in Daniel 9, 26 and 27, right? This predicts the destruction of literal Jerusalem, and this prophecy actually begins in the year 576 BC, right? And that's the prophecy of the 70 weeks that we find. And it takes us all the way through to the year 34 AD. Let's read the section that deals with the last week of the 70-week prophecy, which is 490 years. This is the time when Jesus was on earth, when he was anointed the Messiah, that was when he was baptized, up to the time of his death, and then to the time when Stephen was stoned, which was AD 30. So let's read Daniel 9, 26 and 27. And this is when the last week of this 70-year time prophecy is beginning.
After the 62, read
Go ahead, Auntie. You read on.
And after the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end of it shall be with a flood, and till the end of the war, desolations are determined. Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abominations shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation, which is determined, is poured out on the desolate.
Okay. Now, this, we are clear now, this is speaking about the destruction of the literal city of Jerusalem. Now, the question is, who are the people of the prince who are to come that are going to destroy the city and the sanctuary? Now, many think that the people of the prince are the Roman legions that come and destroy the city. Now, there are three ways of looking at this. We have studied this before, but let's review it again. If you read the parable that is given in the Gospel of Matthew 22, 1 to 14, it says that God destroyed the city of Jerusalem. He used his armies, he used the Roman armies to destroy. But also, there's evidence that the Jews themselves destroyed their own city by rejecting the Messiah. We read this in Luke 19, 41 to 44. Remember, they said they didn't know the hour of the visitation. That's why Jesus spoke about the destruction of the city and the temple. So those, the people of the prince are the Jews, and the prince is Jesus. And they destroyed their own city by rejecting the Messiah. So verse 26, remember, the desolation comes after the abomination of desolation. So if we look at the parallel passage of Luke 21, 20 to 21, it speaks about Jerusalem being surrounded by armies. So Daniel had already prophesied the abomination of desolation because of the rejection by the Jewish nation of the Messiah, who was anointed at the beginning of the last week when he was baptized in AD 27, who was cut off in the middle of the last week in AD 31, because the Jewish nation rejected him as the Messiah. We are told twice in this passage that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. These verses describe the trampling of literal Jerusalem in the year AD 70. It is significant that the very words abomination and desolation that appear in Matthew 24:15 appear here. However, there will be a second abomination of desolation at the very end of time. And this will occur, like we have discussed, after the pause period between the first and the second abomination of desolation. We are in the pause period right now. Okay, we don't know when and how soon that will end. So let's go to our Bibles to Revelation 17. Let's read Revelation 17 verses 1 to 3.
Then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and talked with me, saying to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication." So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns.
Now, when John says he took me in spirit, means he took him in vision, right? Not physically, in vision, right? So here it's describing this harlot, the final abomination of desolation, right? Then let's move on. Now, notice the characteristics of this woman. She's a harlot. They are clearly told in verse 1 that she's a harlot. It says, I will show you the judgment of this great harlot. A woman in Bible represents a pure woman represents the pure church. A harlot woman represents an apostate church, a church that has lost her way. So obviously, this is a church that has apostatized, right? Now let's read Revelation 17 verses 4 and 6 and then 15 and 16.
The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations, and the filthiness of her fornication. And on her forehead a name was written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I marveled with great amazement. Then he said to me, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are people, multitudes, nations, and tongues. And the 10 horns which you saw on the beast, these will hate the harlot, make her desolate and naked, eat her flesh, and burn her with fire.
Remember, Revelation is symbol, right? So the wine of abominations includes especially the change in God's holy law from worshipping on the Sabbath, the seventh day, to worship on Sunday, which they call the Lord's, substituting human legislation in place of divine legislation. That is the wine of abomination. And it says she's a mother. So she must have daughters that are born from her after some time, born to her after some time. So a mother means it's once again a apostate church that was born during this period, right? So this harlot is going to have a second period of dominion, just like we noticed in Matthew 24, that in Matthew 24, we know there are two periods of tribulation, one tribulation, but with two periods. Because we have the papacy ruling in the past, and the papacy also is going to rule in the future, the Bible tells us, after a period of crossing. Now we are in the, like I said, in the pause period between the past tribulation by the papacy and the future tribulation to come by the same power. It's one tribulation with a pause in between, right? Verses 15 and 16 are Revelation chapter 17. We already noticed that this harlot is full of abominations, and she has daughters who do her bidding, who follow what she tells them, right? So, and we know that the waters clearly give us that there are people, multitudes, nations, and tongues. So the act of sitting means that the harlot rules over nations, sit over people, right? But what's going to happen to this harlot and all her daughters, which are the churches that were born, that came into being during this time, which we studied, is found in verse 60. So if we all notice that Matthew 24, we all notice that Matthew 24 focused primarily on the destruction of Jerusalem and the end time events that lead up to the destruction of the world. However, Luke gives us a glimpse not only into the destruction of Jerusalem, it gives us a glimpse, it shows us also the events that lead up to the destruction of the world. But it also provides us, and it provides us a clear representation of the period in between the destruction of literal Jerusalem and the end of time, right? And what will happen during that period. So this is the reason why we need to look at all three synoptic gospels for us to understand the greater picture, because we might not find all the information in just Matthew 24. We have also studied, we also have to study Matthew 24, Mark 13, like I said, and Luke 21, because they provide extra details, right? And then we have to also compare Revelation chapter 11. Then we went to Revelation chapter 12, which is an amplification of it, and Revelation chapter 13. And then we went to Daniel 7 and Daniel 8, and we saw the full picture of the time of the Gentiles, right? So all these passages describe the same period, the period of papal dominion from AD 538 to 1798, when primarily in Europe, the papacy ruled with an iron fist, iron hand. And Revelation 13:3 tells us that that deadly wound of this system is going to be healed. And by the way, it's rapidly healing if you notice events in the world. And when it does heal, we will have the second stage of the tribulation, of which we will speak about a little later in our study series. So I hope you understood the time of the Gentiles and who the Gentiles are, so that now we have a